And now, the Council CD feature interview, Understanding Complex Oppositional Defiance Disorder, with AACC President Dr. Tim Clinton and his guest expert, Dr. Gary Sibsey.
Gary, explain to us your biggest concerns for what you see out there in counseling and psychotherapy with children.
There's a lot of need for services for kids. I think there's big gaps in our ability to treat them. There's probably not enough counselors, child therapists out there, and certainly not enough Christian-trained counselors and clinicians who can work with families within their own value system, within the faith, and that can really work with parents on both the spiritual side and their child's emotional developmental side. So that's a huge area.
Would it be fair
concern.
to say, Gary, that children are probably our most underserved population? There's huge number of kids who need mental health related care, and the number of kids actually receiving care, that's a big gap.
It's a huge gap, and I think that the church and in Christian universities and training centers are really called to fill that gap. And, some of the ways we'll talk about at some point in time, but, we need churches to come on board and help parents find more ways of dealing with these sort of complex issues that their children may face, and in a way that is effective on the one hand, Christ-centered, biblically based, and often professional. Sometimes it's not just that we want to offer services that are just supportive. Sometimes I think churches may actually be able to intervene differently.
Gary, I know another issue we've talked a lot about is this idea of adult models of intervention superimposed on kids.
Yeah, we see a lot of that. I mean, some really effective models out there for adults. For example, cognitive therapy for depression, interpersonal therapy for depression. These are great models that are very effective for adult types of problems. But the problem is that they don't really generalize well down to kids. And so, you see these treatment manuals that sort of come out with, for kids with these types of problems, and they're somewhat effective, but they don't really deal with some of the developmental differences that kids bring in to the office. And they're somewhat naive in those regards, and they just don't work as well. And the other side is that you see treatments that are developed for kids that don't look like the kids that we actually treat. In other words, to do a treatment study, a lot of times you get kids with just one diagnosis, just ODD or just depression or just anxiety or just ADHD. When in actuality, most kids have at least a couple of these things going at the same time. And those models are not really designed to handle the complexity of the problems that we see.
Gary, to the heart of the issue today, we're going to be talking about anger, defiance, and then a little bit about oppositional defiance disorder, and then specifically complex ODD.
Right.
Take us on the journey, Gary. The idea of dealing with anger and defiance, it raises, it stands the hair up on the back of basically everybody's neck, because when you see defiance in a kid, it just fires you up as a parent, and it rattles you a little bit as a therapist, as a pastor, anybody involved intervening or working with kids. Defiance is a great challenge. First of all, define it for us, take us on that journey, and then I want to talk to you about etiology, where we really think all this is coming from. But start us out, anger, and prescriptively all the way to complex ODD.
Well, the idea of anger and any of these types of emotions, anger, sadness, anxiety, all the emotions are sometimes I think the reason we get really angry about it as parents and even our society is that we tend to assume that people just come into the world with this ability to handle their emotion. Mood regulation is a skill that you learn over time that develops from the time a child's born and they're hungry. They're actually throwing a temper tantrum about that. They're really ticked off, to when we get old and older and we're driving down the road and somebody pulls out in front of us and we get angry and ticked off. Our ability to handle those emotions is something that's developmental. So the problem is that we see kids who lose it and who get angry or who may blow up. We may tend to think that it's just a willpower thing, that they're just willfully losing it and coming unglued. And most of the time it's not. And of course, it depends on how isolated the incident is. I mean, all of us have the capacity to really come unglued and get pretty ticked off. But when parents start getting concerned is that their kids blow up time and time and time again. Defiance is when kids basically are stubborn. They're oppositional. You ask them to do this, they won't do it. They refuse to do it. Another closely related term is oppositionality, where kids oppose what you do. It may not just be defiance in that they say no, but they resist doing it.
So willful defiance.
Willful oppositionality might be defiance, whereas a kid can oppose you passively or overtly. So if you tell them to go clean their room and they sort of go in their room and throw a sock here and throw a sock there and dust a little under the carpet, they're still opposing what you're asking them to do. Or if you say, let's go eat at McDonald's, they say, no, I want to go to Burger King. Okay, let's go to Burger King. No, I want to go to McDonald's. That's sort of the oppositionality that you see. It's where they sort of actively move against you. So it's not so much that it's one thing or another thing that they're stuck on. It's that they're actively moving against you. And that seems to be what really gets parents frustrated.
And then, Gary, the next level is this idea of complex ODD. Take us there.
Well, complex ODD, this is an important one for you clinicians out there and also for parents and pastors who you're going to hear about these kids, and you have heard about them. What we call simple ODD or simple oppositional defiance is a child who's gotten angry. They tend to be oppositional, and a lot of the sort of normal parenting techniques, normal parenting styles can typically handle that quite well. And they respond to it and pretty quickly, and parents are quite satisfied with that. Now, kids with complex ODD are different in that parents are really concerned about the oppositionality, the defiance, the spitefulness, the somewhat vindictiveness, arguing and whining and hovering kinds of behaviors. Their kid can't play by themselves, and they're sort of constantly following the parent around, and this gets frustrating. But usually these kids have at least two other problems going on. One is they often have executive skill problems or what looks like ADHD. They may have full-blown ADHD, or they may have sort of subclinical stuff. They're impulsive, they tend to have too much activity, and they're inattentive. They have a hard time sort of staying focused on anything for too long. They don't really look down the road. They're not motivated by future consequences, and they don't learn from past experiences. So you've got children in that camp who are also oppositional, and they got a third problem, which makes it very sticky. They often have some type of mood dysregulation, and significant mood. It's not that they can just turn it on and turn it off. When these kids get angry and get upset, it takes off like a tornado, and they can't get calmed down. Even getting what they want, the anger, the frustration, the irritability continues, sometimes for hours and hours, and sometimes the residuals of this can go on for days and days. So at that point in time, you've got kids who not only have behavioral disturbance, right? They can't really follow adult requests very well. They don't do the things that they're supposed to do, but they also have problems with attention. They're impulsive. They've got too much activity, and the mood dysregulation. These kids are often the explosive kids, the angry, explosive, and sometimes what we would call the impulsive, aggressive child.
And it gets scary. It gets intimidating.
Absolutely.
And challenging. Anger and defiance in a kid is difficult. When it begins to trip and ratchet up.
Right.
If we don't handle anger well, if we don't like the emotion of anger, we don't allow kids to even express it.
Right.
These kids, it's at a whole nother, we're in a different ballpark.
And what's frustrating as far as where I practice is more of what we call tertiary practice, which means that for people to get there, they usually go through their family doctor.
Crisis. It's everywhere.
They go through counselor after counselor, and most of these counselors have tried various types of behavioral interventions, timeouts, taking things away. Parents have used spanking, they've used yelling, they've used about everything in the book.
And home basically and all their life contexts are just all about going to war 24/7. Right. It's just war, and it's getting worse, not better.
And sometimes what's confusing and what's difficult for parents is that they often get blamed for bad parenting. And what's hard is that these same parents will often have at least one other child who's doing wonderfully.
Wow.
They can have one who's graduating from high school with straight A's or good grades going to college, and then this other child comes along who just, no matter what they do, it doesn't work. Or this is their first child and they just can't get it right, and their second child's coming along and doing just wonderfully. So what happens is that you're seeing with complex ODD is that actually very good parents who have a good skill set can be made to look really awful with these types of kids. And it's really important to realize that it's not necessarily bad parenting that gets you to complex ODD.
So, Gary, you're in this scenario where you've got Johnny in front of you. You're trying to do an initial analysis of Johnny. Mm-hmm. Parents are there. You may have a school official or two or some type of reports, maybe even some type of police, complex situation. You're trying to make sense of it and trying to ratchet everything down. This thing's all over the place. How do you ratchet yourself down as a therapist? I mean, does it come back to saying, okay, listen, I've got to understand what is seated right here?
Right.
And does that relate back to etiology? Do you sort of calm yourself so you don't get caught up in the moment by just saying, wait a second, this is a pretty complex defiance issue going on here. This is beyond ODD, and we're into a very complex situation. How are you processing this for yourself?
In a few minutes, we'll probably go through what the model is so that you can sort of understand what are some of the core problems involved with this complex ODD. Right? We don't want to just describe symptoms, which we've already done. We want to be able to describe some of the underlying processes that are involved in this.
What is the etiology behind this? Where's this coming from? How do you see it?
Well, usually it's not something that just started yesterday. Complex ODD is something that generally has been sort of cooking for quite some time. These kids are often from birth or very early in life have difficulties getting calmed down, all right, and too much activity. And they were too hyper in the preschool, and when they hit their terrible twos, they really hit them hard. Parents will often complain that they've never really been able to manage this child very well at all. It's not something that just sort of emerges out of sort of a child's developing normally on all levels, and then all of a sudden you wake up one day and bam, you've got this. It's not normally that way. But what we talk to parents about in the research on this is quite enormous, is that children with this type of ODD, these types of behavioral emotional problems, have what we call core cognitive skill deficits. And this is often where we start out with parents, is explaining what are these 5 core cognitive skill deficits.
Walk us through it, Gary.
Well, at the root of it is one of the cognitive skills that these kids don't have is affect regulation or mood or emotion regulation. Now, there's a couple pieces to this. The first one is what we call frustration tolerance. These children generally have not developed this much. So when they get frustrated, their mood goes from 0 to 10 real quickly. That's one part of emotion regulation. The other part is that their mood it's not just reactive. So whenever something doesn't go their way or they get frustrated, that they get out of control emotionally. But they can have moods that seem to come out of nowhere, unprovoked. They just sort of wake up and they're in a real grumpy, irritable, grouchy mood that is not sort of related to any context. And of course, this is terribly frustrating to adults and parents because they're thinking, why are you like this? Why are you doing this? Now, what's important to realize is that behavior, when you think of behavioral problems in kids, almost all behavioral problems in children are a result of poor mood regulation skills. Mm-hmm. It's rare that you have kids who just act out when they're not frustrated or angry or emotionally dysregulated.
Sure.
All right. So that's one of the core problems. The second core problem that you see is that these kids are cognitively inflexible. Now, when a person is cognitively inflexible, they tend to see things as black, white, all, nothing, either or, I win, you lose kind of mindset. Right, so molehills do become mountains for these kids. That's really important because a lot of people can sort of shift mindsets, right, and become flexible. Like, oh, okay, we're not eating at McDonald's, we're going to go to Burger King.
It's not that big of a deal.
But when you're cognitively inflexible, and you know adults out there who are like this, when their pattern gets broken, their mood starts to change and they get really upset, really angry, or get really frustrated quickly. Another thing about cognitive flexibility is that when you don't have it, you typically find that the problems arise in transitions. Most of these problems parents think come out of the blue, but I assure them very early in treatment that we'll probably find a handful of situations where Junior gets upset and loses it, and most of them are around transitions. Getting up in the morning, going to school, coming home from school, going from school to homework, from homework to TV, from TV to bedtime to bathing. All of these transitional points is where they can have difficulty. And sometimes they have a hard time transitioning or shifting their mindset from one thing that they may not even enjoy all that much to something that they really would enjoy. They may be sitting at home bored, and you might say, hey, let's go to an ice cream at Dairy Queen. And these kids will go, no, I don't want to. Right. Well, why? I mean, why wouldn't you want to do that? You might think that it's just being a stinker, but sometimes they just have a tremendous difficulty shifting. And if you think about it, a lot of their oppositionality is around that. Mm-hmm. Right. Third area is that they lack problem-solving skills. And you think about problem-solving skills are quite complex. There's a number of things that you have to be able to do
to get there, and they're complex cognitive activities.
One of them, for example, is that you have to be able to know what the problem is. Right? What is bugging you? These kids have, and we'll talk about another skill in a minute, they have a hard time actually knowing what's bugging them and labeling it and putting words on it. They don't do it very well. Then they have a hard time with foresight, understanding how solutions will have outcomes. They don't understand how what I do now will affect future outcomes. Even 5 to 10 or 20 minutes down the road, they have a hard time. And they have a hard time choosing between outcomes. They have not developed the skill very well. In addition, they don't learn from past experiences very well. What happened in the past doesn't often influence how they make decisions in the present. Now, these are important cognitive skills that are not in place for these kids. And what's important to realize is that they especially aren't in play when they get upset. If you think about yourself as an adult, right, when you get upset, your IQ usually goes down. I know mine does. Kid around my kids, I sometimes say my IQ goes down 50 points when I get ticked off, and my kids go, "No, Dad, it goes down 100 points."
You lock is what you do. You just absolutely lock in, and you don't see what's going on around you. Right. Anger is a state of preparation to respond to a real or perceived wrongdoing or injustice in my life.
Exactly. And if you think of it neuropsychologically, your thinking brain, your problem-solving brain is actually slow and inefficient. When you're in a crisis state, you don't have time for slow inefficiency. You have to get into a reactive mode. So your brain automatically clicks off, and your problem-solving skills evaporate when you're under duress. When you're either stressing because you're angry or anxious, your problem-solving brain often clicks off. For these children, their problem-solving brain clicks off a lot.
When we teach on anger, then, be slow, listen when you're angry. Your brain isn't working like that. You're zoned out in some other area. So then just a simple strategy like that makes no sense because they don't have that skill.
And it's an important thing to keep in mind for kids who may have experienced any trauma for whatever reason. When the brain's traumatized, right, especially early in life, then the predominant mode for your brain is to be in the crisis, flight or fight or freeze phase. When it's in, and anything can trigger it. For example, a child who's yelled at a lot at home, that tends to wire the brain for, reactivity into fight-flight. It clicks off the learning part of the brain. It also happens to be that these kids, when they go to school, for example, and a teacher sort of is, being firm, not inappropriate, but being firm, this child's brain immediately clicks to fight-flight. Yeah. And they don't learn. Now, another cognitive skill that's huge is language skills. Language skills are your ability to label what you feel, what you think, okay, and why you feel that way. These kids are not good at doing it. So when you ask them, what's wrong, what's the problem, they'll often go, I don't know. Well, most of the time we think they know, but they just don't want to tell us. In fact, they really don't know. They don't know how to label what is actually in there and to put words on it. Now, what's important is if you can't label it, then you can't move it to the next level of problem solving. You can't problem solve something that you can't label. These children don't do it well. Now, it also happens to be when kids can't label their internal world, they lack empathy. If you don't understand how you feel, you certainly have no idea, nor do you care what anybody else is thinking or feeling. So they don't see the impact of their behavior and their attitudes on other people, but largely because they don't even know how they're feeling. They're reacting but not labeling. So those skills are often the place. And when we talk to parents about this, they'll say, yeah, you're right. He can't do any of those things.
Gary, the tendency would be to try to regulate or control this through behavioral strategy, which only exacerbates the problem.
Exactly. In fact, the behavioral strategies, as we'll talk, literally bypass trying to help children develop these cognitive skills. These cognitive skill deficits are not frozen, meaning that they cannot be changed. They can be influenced, but you have to influence them by treating children as if they have minds. Behaviorism assumes you don't have a mind. Doesn't really care why you feel that way or why you're doing what you're doing or why you're behaving the way that you're behaving. It simply wants to terminate the behavior. Whereas what we're going to talk about down the road is an approach that actually works at helping the child use his brain to learn these skills.
Let's talk about the brain just for a moment, Gary. The neurological, neurochemical factor here, can you explain it to us a little bit as you're understanding what's going on now in light of what you just explained here? What's happening in the brain? Because that probably will take us into another area of understanding of what's sitting across from us.
Well, one of the things we've learned about the brain is that it's plastic. There's plasticity, which means it can be influenced by social interaction. And at the state of the art of neuroscience now is that the brain is a social organ, that we can really work on it, not just in a general way, in very specific ways. So there's 3 brain systems that are in play here. And the problem is that they don't all work together. They all work for this child, but they don't work together. So they're not integrated. The first brain system is the limbic system. This is the emotional system that often is the genesis of where children get frustrated. That means that their limbic system is turning on. And I usually point to parents right above their right ear, okay, in that arena between their, say their right ear and their temple. That area is generally where the limbic system is.
Okay.
All right. Now, children who are in this camp tend to operate out of that part of their brain most of the time. All right. But when it gets fired up, it turns off the rest of the brain. The next part of the brain, if you move up, and it's sort of right behind your eyes, okay, is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that actually does the labeling of what's happening in the limbic system. So let's say that a kid's getting angry and upset, right? And they have virtually no control over that emotion at that point in time until you label it. So when you ask a kid, what's bugging you, right, you're actually activating the prefrontal cortex. You want that to come on. What is it? Is it this? Is it that? Is it this? Is it that? Helping them label it puts it into that realm. Right, to the prefrontal cortex. The frontal cortex, and particularly more of the left hemispheric frontal cortex, is more of the problem-solving part of the brain. But nothing can get into the problem-solving brain until it gets labeled. It's at that point that we can get them working together. That we can get that part of the brain going. If we can calm the child down some, does that make sense? So that if the limbic system is going too hard, the prefrontal cortex and the cerebral cortex are not going to turn on. So we have to teach parents how to help their children get calmed down, take the heat out of the situation. Then we want to work on labeling what the problem is and then move it into problem solving. Does that make sense? Behavioral approaches do not believe in this because they don't think the brain really matters.
So let me clarify something right here, though, too. Okay. We're talking about a spectrum here of moving from anger into more defiance, into ODD, into complex ODD. More behavioral strategies probably work at that anger, early defiance area. Would you say that's true?
I would say that they only work at it on the surface.
More of a symptom reduction type of thing.
Right. If you think that anger, and if the anger is simply a motivational problem, right, they want to act this way in order to get this, they're motivated to do it, then behavioral techniques work beautifully.
And there is an element of childhood that's there.
Exactly. So behavioral techniques work great for motivational problems, but they don't work well for skill deficit problems.
That's a different range of kids.
That's a different range of kids. So, for example, there's kids who are bright, but who have reading disorders. If you think about it, reading disorder on the surface looks like a motivational problem because kids who don't read well or have a hard time with comprehension or phonetics, they're not motivated to read. And on a simplistic level, one might think, well, gee, if we could just get them to read more, they'll overcome this reading problem. You know, the problem, boy, is that you don't read enough. You need to read more. So I'm going to pay you $5 a book that you read. Well, the problem is that doesn't really change. It doesn't work, right? I mean, that's, for example, accelerated reader is a thing that they use in school that is designed to motivate kids to read more. Well, what ends up happening with accelerated reader is all the great readers get on board and read a ton. But the kids who have reading problems, they don't read any because it's not a motivational problem. In order to treat a reading disorder, you have to treat the underlying processing deficits, right? And when you do that, then children can learn to read better and their motivation for reading goes up.
Sure.
Same thing for baseball, right? If kids aren't good at baseball, they're not going to be motivated to play.
Right.
So we have to sort of deal with their skill deficits where they are.
Put them in positions or opportunities where they can have success and be excited about what they're doing.
Exactly. Without expecting that they're going to perform like the kids who are really gifted and come into the program.
Very different world.
So in the same way, when we look at complex ODD, it's probably best understood as emotional learning disorder. These kids don't have the cognitive skills in play for handling really strong emotion. And as a result, when you can't handle strong emotion, your behavior is going to be dysregulated. It's rarely ever the case that people who have emotional dysregulation don't have behavior dysregulation.
So then, let me go back then to our discussion about the brain. Mm-hmm. Neurologically and then neurochemically, is there an issue there that we need to be aware of?
Well, yeah. So what we know is that the higher levels in the brain, so the cerebral cortex and the prefrontal cortex, are not really developed the way that we want them to. Okay, and it's not that they're smaller, but if you look at them on PET scans, these kids don't have those parts of the brain operating as much as we'd want them to.
It's not lighting up.
Right, it's not lighting up. Now, the way that we'll teach parents how to do it is what we want is all three of those parts to brain to work together. In other words, some kids can feel, but then they can't think. Mm. Other kids, when they think, but they're not feeling. We want kids who can both think and feel. And the way you do that is that you get both sides of the brain operating at the same time so that the limbic system is operating and the frontal lobe is operating. And we always kid around in one of the courses I teach on neuropsych is that neurons that fire together wire together. Right? So if you get limbic neurons firing and frontal lobe neurons firing, then they create dendritic connections.
Which really goes back to your idea that the brain is a social organ then.
Exactly. And just as if you want to build biceps, right, really our understanding of exercise and how it works has been developed more over the last 100 years. We used to think, gee, if you want to develop biceps, you got to exercise. Well, exercise, well, okay, then I'll walk or run. No, that won't quite do it. Well, you got to lift weights. Well, I like bench press. Well, bench press is great, but it's not going to do anything for your biceps.
Right.
That you need actually very specific types of challenges to those muscles to get them to grow. But we do know that if we challenge them, they'll grow. In the same way that we got to help these kids challenge their brain so they'll grow. Now, the problem is that if I overwhelm the muscle, I'll tear it. So if you challenge it too much, you won't get any growth.
So it's the old support challenge idea.
Yeah, you got to get.
So you can't treat then what you don't see, and that's why I love this discussion because I think so many kids aren't getting the treatment that they need. At this particular point, then, our understanding has progressed. Are there any type of assessment type of tools or measures that you think counselors really need to be aware of, that pastors and parents should develop at least an awareness too of and understanding these type of tools? What do you recommend?
Well, a lot of times we like a more comprehensive assessment if we can. And as a counselor, you may be able to use some of these tools, and then you might also consider a referral to like a clinical psychologist to do some other assessments, right? Because you probably want to see where this kid is in terms of their cognitive development. right? So usually some IQ testing and perhaps even neuropsych testing can be helpful. But as far as a counselor, a couple different things that you want to do. One is you have to have a really good interview where you're not just assessing behavioral problems, but you want to look for mood problems like depression, like anxiety problems.
Because you're seeing a lot of comorbidity
Absolutely.
at this level.
In fact, in these cases, comorbidity is the rule, not the exception.
It's just there.
In fact, many of the studies show that a vast majority of kids who have complex ODD have at least one type of mood problem.
Okay.
So one of the interviews that we use, if you have Russell Barkley's The Defiant Child, it's a fantastic work text. It happens to be too behavioral in my estimation for treating kids, but it's effective in that. But
Barkley is the guy who's the big ADHD guy,
and he's also well known for ODD, but not necessarily complex ODD. But he has an assessment package that is embedded in that book and a structured clinical interview that covers basically everything. It's a fantastic instrument, and when I have residents or interns come to the hospital, they have to use that manual. Another set of scales, the BASC, the Behavior Assessment System for Children, its second edition is out now, and it's a comprehensive assessment. It assesses child, parent, teacher. It also has behavior observation and a very structured developmental history.
So the BASC looks across context.
Right, which is very important because you want to see what kind of symptoms are measured across various contexts, home, school, peers. And it also is what we call a broad-banded measure, so that it's not just looking at behavior symptoms like defiance. It also looks at aggression, hyperactivity. Those are more what we call externalizing symptoms than the internalizing symptoms like somatization, kids who complain of stomach problems and headaches, anxiety, depression, social skill deficits. It's also picking up on learning problems, and even for adolescents, picking up on their own report of ADHD symptoms. So that's a great instrument. There's also the Conners scales, which are more behaviorally oriented and tap into ADHD.
CONNER?
Yes. The Conners scales are very helpful. And then the Achenbach Child Behavior Checklist is another good instrument. If you just want to get one instrument that you can use, that is very flexible and has lots of different uses, the BASC is one of your better ones, especially the BASC-2.